Well, good afternoon. My name is Pete Peterson, and I am Dean of Pepperdine School of Public Policy. I want to thank you all for joining us for our panel discussion on housing finance reform. For all of those of you watching remotely via our live stream, thank you for tuning in. Welcome to the next of our California to Capitol Hill conversations, a series of panel discussions around policy issues that have implications both federally and in our home Golden State. In our last conversation, we looked at the issue of public sector pensions from a variety of perspectives. And today, we return to the subject of our first conversation back in 2017, housing finance. Our intention for today's event is to have a thoughtful, thought-provoking, vibrant conversation on what 2019 could mean for Fannie Mae and Freddie Mac, two primary pillars of the nation's mortgage market, which are now in their 11th year of conservatorship. It seems like an important time for this conversation. A Google search of Fannie Mae and reform yields over 1 million results. But of course, the problem is, what does reform actually mean? Pepperdine School of Public Policy reached out and invited a number of individuals to join us for today's discussion, and we're so thankful for those of you here who are joining us on this important panel. The current state of our secondary mortgage market has captured the national attention as well as California's. Back home, access to affordable housing in underserved and minority areas is slowly slipping away from future homeowners as costs go up and guidelines for taking out a mortgage become ever more complex. Housing affordability became the central issue of our recent statewide elections. In fact, as a heads up, we'll be hosting our own A Home in California conference on our Malibu campus next month, continuing to explore issues related to housing affordability in the nation's most populous state. There has been signaling from Capitol Hill and plans set forth from various industry groups over time, most recently from the National Association of Realtors, defining something they're calling reform. Of late, much of the interest has seemed to center on what the administration can do and what they will do. Acting Director of the Federal Finance Agency, Joseph Otting, of course, has made it clear that he and his team are spending an enormous amount of time on ending the conservatorship and are focused on making sure they're well capitalized. Last week, at his confirmation hearing, Mark Calabria, the nominee to lead the Federal Housing Finance Agency, emphasized safety and soundness of the GSEs and his willingness to work with Congress on reform measures they are considering, leading conservative finance pundit Charles Gasparino to worry in a recent piece in the New York Post, quote, "What's being contemplated right now isn't reform, but a replica of past policies." For those of you watching on our live stream, you may submit any questions and thoughts on our discussion today by using the Twitter hashtag Pepperdine Public Policy. I love introducing myself as Pete Peterson, as the Dean of Pepperdine School of Public Policy. But without further ado, it's my pleasure to introduce our panelists, each of whom have graciously given of their time. Some were here at our first conversation on this topic about a year and a half ago, and excited to welcome some newbies to this discussion. We'll begin to my left. Mike Calhoun is president for the Center for Responsible Lending. Landon Parsons is a senior advisor at Moelis & Company. Jerron Levy is the director of policy and government affairs for the National Community Reinvestment Coalition. Ron Haney is a senior vice president at the Independent Community Bankers Association. Michaela Zonta is a senior policy analyst on the housing team at the Center for American Progress. Tom Vartanian is the founder and executive director for the Program on Financial Regulation and Technology at George Mason University's Antonin Scalia Law School. Please join me in welcoming our panel. I want to get right into our conversation. For those of you seated here, you have the bios for our panelists there at your desk. And so I want to focus our time first on a panel conversation for about 30 minutes or so, and then open it up to questions from you all, and obviously those who might be watching via live stream. So I want to telescope this conversation, begin with kind of where we are, get your thoughts on your opinions of where we are currently, what some of the issues are that are operating, and then distill down into some of your own opinions about what you think GSE reform should look like. So we'll start with what is, and then we'll talk about what should be. So I want to begin, and I'll start with you on this, Mike, and we'll just go down the line. When considering a reform solution, what are the components that you say are absolutely vital to ensure market stability, taxpayer protection, and adequate access to affordable housing? Let's talk first about what do you think, what components should at least be considered?
So with the two sort of poles there, protecting taxpayers and increasing support for affordable housing are two of the givens of any structure. I think the other is political stability of a structure. That for recapitalization, you're asking investors to put in $100 billion to $150 billion of new capital in all likelihood, something like that. They're not going to do that unless they think the structure they're investing in is politically stable, that there are not going to be dramatic changes in the rights of shareholders. So those are sort of the essentials there. And then for all the noise, there's a lot of consensus on portfolio limits, paid for capital, more private capital. There's a lot that actually is agreed upon. There are only, I would submit, around 4 basic questions that you have to answer in this. The first one, which gets a lot of play, is what is going to be the number of guarantors? And you go from the 2 current, the GSEs, to, I would call at the other extreme, the Crapo model, where you have to have no guarantor can have more than 20% of the market. You got to have at least in perfect market 5, but they talk about maybe 10 different guarantors. The second and the key is how do you address affordable housing? And those 2 issues are closely interrelated and are responsible for a lot of the logjam here, because a multiple guarantor structure greatly increases the challenge of providing affordable housing in 2 ways. And then I'll wind up and let others talk. But I think this has been where most of the debate has hit. So a multiple guarantor sets back affordable housing in 2 ways, and then you have to find ways to try and overcome it if you go that route. The first is pretty much everyone agrees that a multiple guarantor system will have hyper risk-based pricing, that guarantors will have to will have no ability to level price any of the guarantee fee, and instead will have to very much carve it in the tiniest segments, otherwise they get adversely selected. If you are trying to do any cross-subsidy, someone else is not doing that, you're out of the market. That's not a workable business model. And the challenge is, currently the GSEs provide, and it varies depending on the market, $3 to $5 billion of cross-subsidy. That is their biggest dollar affordable housing program, is cross-subsidy of the G fee,
Right.
where they very substantially level out the pricing. So you've got to overcome that. And then again, due to the nature of a multiple guarantor model, there will be pressure to cream the market, to go for the most profitable mortgages, the highest wealth borrowers in urban concentrated areas. That's the most profitable business model. And again, if you don't do that, you are at a handicap when you're competing in the market. And so that makes it tougher to ensure that these guarantors are in fact going to serve the whole market. You will if you need a more interventionist regulatory structure when you have this vast number of guarantors to ensure that they carry out that core duty of broad access to the market.
Right.
So I think that's a big part of what the whole debate about is with GSE reform today.
Landon, your thoughts on what are the elements that should be in the conversation here?
I think basically there's three core elements that should be thought of. And I believe there's a real coalescence going on in the marketplace right now. You continue to see a lot of noise about the arguments about some of the edges and some of the implication standards. But at the end of the day, there's been, particularly over the last 6 to 8 months, there's been a very much a convergence towards some form of administrative control and administrative reform. There are exceptions to that, of course, with the Crapo-Johnson transaction or outline that recently came forth. But they all center around basically everything most everybody agrees on is three things. The first is you gotta have significant, strong levels of capital. Without significant, strong levels of capital, you can't have safety and soundness. You can't have taxpayer protection, and you can't unleash the creativity as well as to provide sufficient buffers to the system to actually create dynamic, affordable housing. If you're running everything on a shoestring, there is, quite frankly, no excess capital left to create programs that actually help people. So strong capital is by far the most important issue, and I think people are coming to a consensus on that, particularly with the dialogue that's been spurred on because of the FHFA's recent proposals for minimum capital standards.
Right.
The second big issue, as Mike was speaking about, when referring to whether you have one guarantor, two guarantors, six guarantors, or alternatively, or in addition to that, do you have an entity-based guarantee or do you have securities-based guarantees actually on the mortgages? Those are all kind of implementation steps. And those implementation steps, if people step back and actually look at what they're trying to solve, what they're trying to solve is what is Fannie's and Freddie's role in the secondary market and what is their role in the primary market. And with good regulation, you can answer those questions without turning the entire system upside down, which in many respects is what I feel is the Crapo position, the Crapo outline is trying to do. And then I think the third thing that people are really focused on, and I've touched on this briefly already, is affordable housing. You mentioned your own state. I've been doing a lot of looking at California recently, particularly.
So have I, by the way.
And I've always thought it was like a Northern California problem. It's not. It's the entire state. It's the north, the south, the valley, everything in between. There's a massive shortage of affordable housing. And to put that in place, you know, the existing system with having cross guarantees of G fees inside the duopoly, which is Fannie and Freddie, you know, provides significant value to enhance the need for affordable housing. Mike here and the Urban League last year wrote a really seminal paper where they explained that the 10 basis points, which was originally floated in the Corker 2.0 last year and then most recently in Senator Crapo's outline, is tremendously insufficient to offset the cost-subsidized G fee that's in there today. So net, strong capital, putting a box around Fannie's and Freddie's role, and solving the affordable housing issue. Those are the three main core issues, and what we're talking about now is just basically how we get there.
Jerome.
Well, first of all, I would say, you know, first of all, we want to solve for the real problems. I think that with the GSEs, you know, in 2008, there was the Housing and Economic Recovery Act, which was the first post-crisis significant reform of the GSEs in the secondary mortgage market, and I think people overlook that.
Yep.
There's been, there's been significant reform. There's been significant reform of the financial marketplace at large. So I think, we've come from a place of, is such a dramatic overhaul necessary?
Right.
And so.
From
we're
the current conservatorship.
From a lot of the reforms made by HERA, the reforms made by the Dodd-Frank Act, and some of the reforms that have occurred in the conservatorship.
Right.
I mean,
Okay.
there is no return to the status quo ante, okay? The pre-crisis GSEs, there's just been significant reform in the system overall. I think their basic credit guarantee business is solid. So again, whether we need, such structural overhaul is a real question. For us, we are, we think that the mission that the enterprises have is very important. So you've got to start and protect a strong mission that requires that they facilitate mortgage credit, affordable mortgage credit to low and moderate income families at a reasonable economic return. So, that mission that is in their charter drives a lot of what they do. We think that mission is very important and should be preserved. Many of the proposals that have been put forth, jettison that core mission
Right.
in the charter. We also think that they also have other statutory affordable housing obligations, the affordable housing goals, which is a numeric benchmark. We think that's very important. It drives a lot of the, product development, research, outreach, and things that the enterprises do to make sure that traditionally underserved segments of the market have access. That is low and moderate income people, rural areas, minority borrowers and communities and all of that. That work is very important, and I think it has to be protected in a system going forward. And then just sort of picking up on something that my colleague Landon said here, we think capital, the capital, are we installing elements that allow the business to work? I mean, we have a $5 trillion market, it's about a $5 trillion market. What is the impact of the reforms on that market? Do we still have the same size of market? So I think the capital requirements and the rate of return can drive a lot of that. So in both regards, they have to be reasonable and have to allow the business to work because a lot of liquidity in the market hinges, on those two pieces. So the capital standards have to be reasonable.
Yeah.
And reflect their actual business model. Monoline insurers, they're not banks. They insure one kind of credit risk. I mean, there are a number of pieces there that should inform reasonable capital standards and a rate of return that allows them to attract capital to the market.
Ron, what elements do you think really need to be considered for whatever moves forward?
It's fascinating when you get down to this part of the table. We've pretty much heard a lot of it already, but
You can second the motion.
You're the cleanup hitter.
Is that what I knew?
I'm batting last in the order.
There you go. So I think a lot of it's been said. The way that we look at it, the way ICBA looks at it, is that number one, it's safety and soundness first. Obviously, our members have to be safe and sound. They have to have real levels of capital. And so from that perspective, safety and soundness is paramount. Obviously, the GSEs were put in conservatorship because, losses were mounting. They didn't have sufficient capital to handle those losses. And at that point, the Secretary of the Treasury decided we better put them in conservatorship. Regardless of, kind of what people might speculate, what happened, what didn't happen, or whatever. At the end of the day, it was concerned that they didn't have high levels of capital, which they did not, and that during the tsunami of the financial crisis, when things were blowing up everywhere, the Treasury Secretary acted under HERA and along with the FHFA director at that time and put him in conservatorship. If they had been well-capitalized entities to some of the levels that we're talking about today, in today's conversation, that probably wouldn't have happened. Or at least it would have been a much different argument around it. So for us, it's capital, and it's meaningful levels of capital. That's the first thing. And then I think the rest of the contours of the debate, I think, one of the reasons that legislative reform has not happened is because, number one, the system works. It's working very well. It actually worked very well through the crisis. Now, yes, you can say that's because the government stepped in and said, okay, we're going to support you. I get that, but the system works. So when you hear arguments around it's a failed business model or, it's broken or whatever, I'm sorry, an enterprise, a business that can throw off billions of dollars worth of earnings and keep the mortgage market running with very low interest rates and access to credit, broad access to credit. Obviously, there's always room to improve, but it's hard to say, okay, so tell me again why it's not working. And if you're a lender, like a lot of our members are, they have to ask that question, well, what's not working? So it's fix what doesn't work. It's fix what's broken. And so I think it's around keeping them focused on mission and structurally finding a way to keep them focused on their mission. What's the primary market? What's the secondary market? And I think also part of that is, where should they be focused? Should they be, should we be encouraging all this competition in the government-supported secondary market, or should that competition be in the primary market and in the private secondary market? And we contend it should be in the private, non-government supported market. And that's where it rests today. We have mortgage lenders that compete with each other, banks that compete with each other. We have entities on Wall Street and other private investors that compete with each other to buy product, to sell that product in the private and the PLMBS market. All those things, that's where that competition should be. The marketplace that is supported by the taxpayer has to have very firm guardrails, and I would say even Jersey walls, that keep those entities in their swim lanes and focus on their mission: affordable housing, access to credit, providing this liquidity in all markets at all times for all lenders in all conditions. And so for us, it's refining the business model, honing in on those couple of structural things that need to be done legislatively, whether it's an entity-based guarantee, a securities-based guarantee, that kind of support, but keeping them focused on mission and then strong levels of capital.
Excellent. Michaela?
Thank you. Well, I'd like to say that many of the comments that we have just heard are also shared by the Center for American Progress. One of my concerns is that, in this political environment in which we have seen multiple attempts at rollbacks, especially in anti-discrimination laws, and attacks on affordable housing strategies. It's really hard to think about a GSE reform that is apart from this larger and critical economic and political environment. There's no doubt that there need to be some changes, but those changes should be built first on the positive aspects of the financial system that have worked so far in the past 10 years. We also need to take into consideration the fact that we can't just think about the GSE reform per se without thinking about other types of reforms that target, for example, the private labor market. So those need to go together. And also, probably the major concern that we have is the concern about, housing affordability across the country. We know that about a third of the U.S. Population has a cost burden. If we look at California, 42% of California households are cost burden. There's a tight credit. If you look at areas like the Bay Area and the Los Angeles area, FICO scores need to be as high as 772, like in San Francisco. So mortgage affordability is very low in those areas. So we need to preserve some of the reforms and strategies that have worked so far to offer affordable mortgages, first of all, but also produce much-needed affordable rental units. And we know that the GSEs have played a paramount role in the multifamily market, so that should be preserved. Another affordable housing aspects of these reforms, Jaron mentioned the affordable housing goals, the duty to serve. Let's not forget the fact that the GSEs are required basically to support funds like the Housing Trust Fund and the Capital Magnet Fund that are very important when it comes to improving the supply of affordable housing for families of all income levels.
Professor Vartanian.
Thank you, Pete. So let me put my thoughts in context, because I'm going to try to be not lawyerly, but a little practical here, because I think the likelihood that we get legislation to do something with the GSEs is probably very low. If anybody believes that we're going to get legislation, I'd love to hear in the discussion what you think and why. But my conclusion is we're not going to get legislation. What do I rely on? The fact that we haven't had legislation in 10 years. And inertia is a terrific force in the government. The second thing, in terms of framing my remarks, is I actually oversaw, as regulator, the Freddie Mac when I was general counsel of the Federal Home Loan Bank Board. I closed 450 thrifts. I know a little bit something about receiverships and conservatorships and how they work. And the law happens to be important here, because we're not going to get from here to there without understanding the law, assuming we're not going to get legislation. I represented some of the executives at Freddie Mac in the crisis, and I represent parties in this whole thing today. So I want to give you that framework in terms of where my remarks are coming from. We're not going to get legislation. So the critical question in my mind is, how do we get from here to there? Everybody's talking about what there looks like, but nobody's talking about how we get from here to there. And that's the critical question. Because, number one, there are shareholders in this company. The FHFA could have appointed a receiver in September 2008 and could have ended the lives of those shareholders. They didn't. For reasons that we all understand and that Hank Paulson puts in his book, they didn't. They appointed a conservator. And a conservator steps in the shoes of the board of directors and the shareholders with the sole purpose of rehabilitating the company and returning it to the shareholders, or liquidating it because the company is not salvageable. Now, what we've got here, and we argued this in the circuit court in the Perry Capital case, we argued that the conservatorship has become effectively illegal because it's not a conservatorship anymore, it's a nationalization. But put that aside, that really doesn't matter at this point. We can't get a court to agree with that because the courts aren't willing to, I think, apply the law the way the law should be applied, because the consequences may be pretty significant. But the question in all of this, it seems to me, is how do we get from here to there? Do we throw the baby out with the bathwater? And I can't agree more with Ron that, Washington tends to make policies based on slogans. And this slogan about let's not make the mistakes of the past, well, that doesn't mean completely gutting the entire structure that we had that seemed to have worked for an awful lot of years in a very effective way and seems to be producing an awful lot of income now for the Treasury. The question is, how do you fix it? Capital is a fix. Dealing with their portfolio is a fix. But as I look at this from a very realistic point of view, what is it you can do to get to the next stage of where they need to be? Because we're not going to get to the nirvana that everybody wants it to be very quickly. How do we get there? And we've got to understand fundamentally where we are, and where we are is we've got companies with shareholders, and those shareholders are in litigation, but those shareholders have to be taken care of somehow in this process. Because if they are not, how do you get new shareholders? Everybody agrees you need another $150 to $200 billion of capital. Well, nobody's going to put that capital into a structure, one, that's broken, two, that doesn't have prospects to pay the shareholder something, and three, that is a company that the government just wiped out the shareholders of. So I think you have to put all that together in terms of trying to create a solution. And I tend to revert to a solution that's administrative and simple, as opposed to, grand schemes that I don't think, as much economic and as much academic sense as they may make, I don't think are going to happen.
Tom, you raise actually that segues well into my next question, which is trying to get a lay of the land for what are the guardrails of the possible right now. I was just looking over in preparing for this, doing a little research. We have someone like Mark Zandi at Moody Analytics who wonders that this is a back to the future moment, and that there's going to be radical change, and that there's this recap and release idea that, in his view, just to quote, we'd be setting ourselves up for the same kind of crisis we had 10 years ago. And then you have somebody like the housing analyst for Raymond James, Ed Mills, said that renewed GSE optimism likely overblown. Quote, we remain skeptical that there will be significant near-term changes to the structures of the GSEs. Previous attempts at GSE reform, to your point, Tom, previous attempts at GSE reform have been bogged down by political, legal, and structural hurdles. So, Landon, I'm going to start with you then on this one. Where do you see as the plus minus here? Where before we get into everyone's particular thoughts on where it should go, where do you think the current state of play is on the range of possibilities for something called reform?
Yeah, thank you. First off, I need to make a statement that I should have made up front, and I forgot to do so I'll make it now.
There's a lawyer here.
Well, he heard mine.
That statement is, I do advise at Moelis & Company, and Moelis & Company does advise the non-litigating preferred shareholders of Fannie and Freddie.
Okay.
So it's appropriate for me to point that out. Moving forward then to get to the specifics of your question, I'm going to kind of work backwards, if you don't mind, from Dr. Zandi's comment. The back to the future, same crises that we had 10 years ago. And I think you opened up the panel with a discussion about Charlie Gasparino last
Yeah.
night and his
Yeah.
comments,
Yeah.
which were entertaining. I think the interesting thing about mortgage credit and mortgage finances is extremely complicated. And if you don't understand the details and you try to simplify everything to 30-second soundbite bullets, it can really lead to misperceptions. And the first one I've really have been, struggling with a way to adequately explain, and I fail consistently because it continues to be repeated, is that this concept of recap and release is somehow bad. Well, first off, as the co-author of the Moelis Blueprint, We have never called it recap and release. We call it reform, regulate, recap, and release. And in our specific plan, we lock in all reforms that have been made to date. And we suggest further reforms that should be made going forward. So in no respect do we, in any respect, suggest there should be a return to the old days. I think what is really important to understand is, and Ron touched on this briefly, is that the reason that Fannie and Freddie got into trouble was principally the mark-to-market write-downs that Fannie and Freddie took on their investment portfolios. They had $1.5 trillion of agency, non-agency and subprime mortgage securities, which basically had not been issued by themselves, that they had purchased in the open market with basically extremely favorable funds because of their status as a GSE. That was a flawed business model. That's why it does not exist anymore. That's why one of the major provisions of HERA was to say, get rid of the investment portfolio. And if you look at every single, this is one thing that everybody does agree on. If you look at every single proposal on reform, whether they be pragmatic in solution or academic in solution, they all call for the continued inability or not to have the ability to do an investment portfolio. That is one of the most important things that have been put in place. And then echoing Jeron's comments a few minutes ago about changes that have been made actually under the conservatorship and what has been made through the ability to repay and the qualified mortgage rule. Even though there is the QM patch, the difference between that and straight QM mortgage is not significantly different. So the addition of a qualified mortgage was a very important addition to the marketplace. So basically, at the end of the day, to get back to the core question in Dr. Zandi's comments, I think Mark's a great guy, and I like him a lot. But I think those kind of comments that are made by him and Charlie and other people in the marketplace that somehow feels that if we implement administrative reform, that somehow we're going back to some sort of Wild West activity. And just to be absolutely clear, we have never advocated a return to Wild West activity. We believe the investment portfolios should be permanently shut down. We think all reforms that have been made to place should be locked in with consent decrees, negative covenants in the Treasury support agreements, and other sorts of contractual arrangements. We see, I think there needs to be a recognition that these are not, to use that advertising phrase, not your father's Oldsmobile.
Mike, I saw you nodding and maybe some questions there. What do you think are the range of possibilities? And to Landon's point, your thought on an agreement that we're not going to return to the so-called Wild West days, but
So
at the same time that there, as Tom had said, that there is a consensus on the part of some that there isn't going to be dramatic change. Where do you think the guardrails are?
So a couple of things. First, as he said, you can't roll the clock back. I mean, there have been fundamental changes that make the market just qualitatively more, much safer agreement that you're going to raise capital. Even today, the GSEs, while they're not allowed to keep the capital, are pricing on the basis of holding capital that would be sufficient for another catastrophic event. You've got the QM mortgage rules, which, if they had been in place, a number of studies show would have cut the losses in the crisis in half. And then, as he said, the portfolios not only took on extra risk, it distorted the GSE's business model, and everyone agrees that investment portfolios should be banned permanently. In terms of options on the table, following up again on Landon's comments, there are existing vast authority vested with Treasury and FHFA. You have what Jeron talked about, the very extensive powers even outside of conservatorship and HERA. You have the government's position in the shares, which may or may not be changed in any reorganization. And then the GSEs for the foreseeable future can only operate with the Treasury line of credit. People, I think there's consensus that there should be a commitment fee for that. But most importantly, Treasury can impose almost any condition it wants on that line of credit, and the GSEs have to take it or not be an operating concern. And so, in many respects, the administration, this one or future one, has a lot of a blank slate of how much they want to impose there. I think two of the big issues, and that is, what's the level of regulatory oversight? Is it HERA, which is there by statute? You're not going to change that. And then there have been calls of some, I call it a broad tent under the rubric of a utility type regulation, where some people see as more conservatorship type of extended powers, not to the extent of having the authority of the board of directors and the shareholders. Some have called, Milken has called all the way for a utility type commission overseeing the GSEs. We think that it is appropriate to have significant additional regulation to make sure that the public mission is furthered, and that, as Ron said, there's a divide, that they stay in the secondary market and not expand in the primary market. We sometimes call it ring fence with an electric fence. The other issue that's more technical is the issuance of the securities. Is it going to be done by the GSEs? Others want Fannie, some want it through the CSP. That I see is, it's an important issue, but these other ones predominate over that. Again, the only two things you really have to have legislation for are to change the charters or the number of people who can get charters, or to provide an explicit government guarantee, either on the security or for the entities. And that latter one, and we can talk about it offline or later, is more symbolic than it affects the markets. It's more of a regulatory matter of how much capital you have to hold. Everyone agrees that $250 billion would get the GSEs probably through two successive great recessions. And that's with the line of Treasury, and we're talking about putting $150 billion of private capital in front of it. Investors don't view the government guarantee as a credit risk versus that kind of capital. Rather, there's some regulatory advantage that you have to hold less capital as holder of a security if it has full faith and credit. And that has different implications, which are all actually quite modest.
Ron, what are your thoughts on where the guardrails are? Again, some are saying that we're not going to see really too much reform. You know, I was looking back over the video of the last panel that we did in the summer of 2017, and it seemed that significant reform was imminent there. And here we are again today, but with some forecasting, dramatic change, and others saying it's really going to be more or less incremental. What are your thoughts on
What the state of play is today?
Yeah.
I actually think, and I've been doing this for a number of years, but I actually think you are going to see some, administrative steps this year. I mean, I think, it's a coalescence of many factors. And so I do think you're going to see the administration make some steps. I mean, all of the key decision makers, Secretary Mnuchin, Acting Director Otting, Mark Calabria has written in this area, seem to be coalescing around action. Mm-hmm. So I actually think it's going to happen. I also think that, they will find ways in whatever action they take to mollify the concerns of, say, Chairman Crapo and others who want to preserve legislative prerogative in the area.
Well, this raises another question, right? Because obviously one of the other complexities to this whole issue is the relationship between the executive branch and the legislative branch. And we've talked about In several instances, the Crapo offering, and Corker's been involved as well, but we also have Otting and the administration getting out saying that this is their blueprint. And so, Ron, I want to draw you in here about this tension, or is there tension, as you see it, between steps that the administration may be taking versus what's coming out of Capitol Hill?
I don't know if I describe it as tension, but I think the administration's trying to communicate very clearly that they actually have the authority to do what, Jerome was talking about, administrative reform, and the FHFA director has that authority and has had that authority all along. The difference was Mel Watt decided not to utilize it. I would say the closest he got to utilizing it was when they did negotiate the $6 billion capital buffer, a year and a half ago, before the GSEs went to zero capital. And so, I think clearly, they're letting Congress know, hey, look, you've had 10 years, and you've put together several pieces of legislation. None of them ever really saw the light of day. I mean, Johnson-Crapo got out of committee. Wasn't a really strong committee vote, and Harry Reid never brought it to the Senate floor. And so it died there. Hensarling's bill, the PATH Act, and then the subsequent one that he dropped right at the end of his term, never saw the light of day. And I think the reason is that, the administration is looking at, well, this is what's been proposed. And every one of those proposals basically blows up a system that works. You've got $5.4 trillion out there. You've got global liquidity. And why would I want to blow up? Why do I want to get behind a legislative proposal that destroys all that for just the sake of saying, oh, we built something new that, gee whiz, kind of looks like the old system. And so, it just doesn't make any sense. The reason that the GSEs are in the shape they're in today with no capital is purely a political one that was made in 2012 by a former acting FHFA director and the Treasury Secretary at the time. And something, whatever the reasons for that, we can debate those all day, but at the end of the day, it's a political decision. There's nothing wrong with the operations of those companies that says they cannot, if allowed to retain their earnings, to, start the process to rebuild their capital, possibly IPO, whatever. And at the end of the day, you've addressed the safety and soundness issues. You address the safety and soundness issues and have strong capital, you can probably you fix the other things too.
Mikhail, I wanted to get your thoughts on this, whether
Yes.
these tracks coming from the administration versus Capitol Hill are mutually exclusive, are on a collision course. Where do you see?
And certainly there's a lot of tension, but with the new Congress, I'm pretty optimistic that much of what's coming from the administration will be significantly challenged. I mean, if we think about, the position, what Maxine Waters, for instance, has been saying about her plan for the next couple of years or so. I mean, she certainly wants to, maintain the structure that has been achieved so far, all the positive reforms that we have come up with, and plus, and so basically she's proposing to work on what we have, what is positive and beneficial to the whole market, and attentive to consumer standards and pricing, that still could be modified, but certainly, I mean, if you ask me, how do you see, at least for the next couple of years, I think, probably legislation will not happen, but there will be a constructive debate.
Between
Yes.
the administration and the legislature?
Yeah.
Okay.
And
Before I get
hopefully
to you,
landed by Congress.
right. Before I get to you, Todd, just let folks know here in the room and also those who are watching us via live stream that we're going to open up to questions, so please be ready when we turn to you all. But Tom, your thoughts on the tracks of reform coming from both Capitol Hill and out of the administration?
Yeah, well, I guess when people say we need legislation, I often just say that we have it. It's 2008, it's HERA. It forethought everything about this. It gave all the authority that FHFA needed to the FHFA. So it's all there. So the question is, who's going to take the step and do it, right? And frankly, I think this was, Garan said this, and I agree with it, that if you look at the people now on the administrative side, from Stephen Mnuchin, Joseph Otting, Craig Phillips, Mark Calabria, if those people don't do it with their knowledge of the mortgage markets and the GSEs, nobody's going to do it. So I do think that they have the capacity to do it. I think they have the will to do it. We'll see how far the will goes. And one of them said to me several weeks ago, if we don't do it, nobody will. And I actually believe that. Because the Congress isn't going to do it. The Congress couldn't do it when it had a Democratic Congress and a Democratic president. They didn't do it when they had a Republican Congress and a Republican president. It's not going to happen. And so the question is, should it happen? And how's it going to happen? And who's going to have the backbone to do it? And then the next question is, can you build something that people want to invest in? That's a fundamental problem here. I mean, people are hypothecating all kinds of different housing systems that I don't think anybody will invest in. So it's got to be somebody, if you want to have this public-private partnership, it's got to be something that people are willing to invest in. And that's a critical question. I go back to what Landon said. You need something that's got the right regulatory structure, get them out of the portfolio business, figure out how you're going to blend a government social project with a private public ownership. And there are companies that do that, but it's very difficult balance. It's not that easy. Figure that out and decide that we're going to have companies with real capital and real regulation and, do it from an administrative point of view. And if the Congress wants to chime in at that point, they have the prerogative to do it. But again, they've had 10 years and it hasn't happened.
Jerome?
Yeah, I was just going to add that the one question that really fascinates me about how they might move forward is this question of, ending the conservatorship or going through some type of receivership process. I mean, those paths are very different. And, there's a lot of speculation in town about whether one of those paths, which of those paths will be taken. Will the conservatorship end and they, sort of return to the market, or are we looking at, a liquidation of the assets or setting up limited life corporation enterprises that have a limited life in the market in thought of transitioning to something else? I mean, I think that question. The answer to that question is very unclear right now.
Ron, do you have?
Yeah,
wincing a bit as the possibilities were outlined.
Right. Well, I agree with Tom. I don't see any prospect of legislation for the very reasons Tom has listed. But to the question that Jaron raises about receivership versus conservatorship, again, Tom said they could have been put in receivership day one, right, at that point in time. Then you probably had a very valid case. The world's blowing up. They're taking losses, no capital, et cetera. Sure, then you can buy that. 10 years, 11 years down the road, and you've returned $280-some billion to the U.S. Treasury. I think you have a hard time supporting that case that these are entities that cannot be capitalized. Again, because there's nothing inherent in their operations that won't let them generate money. They turn on the lights and money happens. So, the reason they have no capital is only a political decision, political reason, and that can be fixed. And so I think they'd have you talk about lawsuits. Yeah, there's lawsuits now, but I think if they put them through receivership, it would be like, a blizzard. So,
Landon, one more just point here for Landon, then we'll go to the audience for questions. Landon?
Yeah, I was just going to point out, I've had a number of conversations with people over the last, 2 to 4 years who at one time or another have suggested receivership, and post our conversations and some reading on their own and some thought, they usually back off of it. And one of the key reasons for that is it's not necessary. Most people who actually advocate for receivership are doing it because they want to create some sort of transition state vehicle.
Mm-hmm.
And so in the Washington bubble chamber, they kind of repeat, okay, well, if we're going to transition from here to here, we need to do something, so we need a transition vehicle. And they just throw the 4 letters LLRE on a page, not really understanding what that means.
Mm-hmm.
I think the most salient point to understand of the whole concept is that our firm, and if you read the 2 versions of the blueprint we've written to this point, we put every single number in that report that supports every conclusion we make. It's completely transparent. I believe it's the only plan that has done that, that's actually put some real numbers into the equation. But our plan says, and it's all there, so you can look at the assumptions, you can say, I don't like that, I don't like this, I want to tweak this, I want to tweak that. But we estimate the warrants of the company is worth $100 to $125 billion once the company is recapitalized. They being the U.S. government, owns 80% of the value of Fannie and Freddie. So by putting them through a receivership, you're hurting the government 4 times more than you're ever going to hurt a shareholder. So it's really not necessary. Everything can be achieved, as I had indicated in a previous answer, through contractual obligations, through negative covenants in the support agreement, through consent decrees. So it's not necessary to put them through the receivership function. You can even change the charter and not have to put them through receivership.
Mike, I wanted to get to your point too.
So I wanted to follow back about the political. I do think the linchpin of a sustainable plan is increased affordable housing measures. You have everyone from Art Calabria to Chairwoman Waters agreeing on that. And I think the political landscape is, Chairman Waters is actually the key player on this. She is the one who would decide whether or not a deal would be cut with Crapo. She is the one who would decide whether or not some of these efforts today to reenact a Jump Start provision to block administrative reform would happen. And the carrot that people are going to dangle towards her is more affordable housing measures. And either one way or another, I think her mission, and she is a quite shrewd and effective legislator, is there will be more affordable housing measures one way or another in connection with the GSEs.
Let's open it up to questions. We have yes in the back. If you can just wait for the microphone, just for the live stream, sorry.
I didn't hear my instruction to wait for the microphone. I'm Alex Pollack of the R Street Institute. Langdon, thanks a lot for bringing up the warrants owned by the Treasury, which is essentially for a free exercise for the rights of 79.9% of the common of Fannie and Freddie. I've forgotten the exact number. It's a thousandth of a cent a share or something like that. What, and this would be my question to you and to any other panelists, maybe Tom, because Tom, you said we have to deal with the facts. The fact are these warrants exist. What should be the Treasury's strategy? What should they do with regard to becoming the potential owner of 79.9% of the common of both companies.
I would look back, we internally and externally have used as a case study what was done with AIG. That administration at that time did a very, very smart job of reintroducing their shares that they owned into the marketplace in such a way that it maximized the value of those shares for the U.S. government. So I think AIG with some tweaks provides an extremely adequate and extremely more than adequate, a great roadmap as to what can be particularly done. The basic tenets of the plan that we wrote across the period of 2 to 3 years, there is through the functions of retained earnings as well as new offerings of primary relisted stock that the government can smartly choose when to place back into the marketplace the particular stock that they have. To begin that whole process, the relisting process, they're going to probably want to exercise their warrants on day one so that there's an understanding for all new capital coming into the equation what dilution actually could or could not affect them. So once you've actually established that framework, following the AIG example, I think is a great model.
So Alex, I think that the warrants is the taxpayer's big payoff, right? And I agree 100% with Landon. So the question is, how do you protect that payoff? Forget the preferred, the senior preferred for the moment. How do you protect that payoff? The way you protect that payoff is actually getting a deal done and getting some capital into the companies, whoever those companies may be, so that the government's got a warrant that it can sell. And that's where I think the end game for the government is. And you can debate the question of how much government involvement you want in these things going forward, and that may have something to say about what financial interest they have. But it seems to me that's the big payday for the government coming out of this transaction. And they've made money, you know, the interesting thing is people say you got to protect the taxpayers. In TARP and these investments have been the best investments the taxpayers have ever made. Maybe unwittingly, but they great investments.
I completely agree, but Alaska and the Louisiana Purchase wasn't bad either.
Quite
Perspective.
interesting points of comparison there. Other questions? Yes.
Rob Zimmer, I represent mortgage bankers and also community banks doing mortgage lending. I want to hear more about the commitment fee, Mike and others, given that, Tom, yes, there's no legislation anytime soon. So do you all believe a commitment fee should be assessed onto Fannie and Freddie to pay for the existing backing, number one? Number two, if you do, how would you go about setting it? What order of magnitude? What are the conditions that make for an effective commitment fee versus a defective one?
I'll jump in with a couple of thoughts. There are a wide range of options there. First of all, the commitment fee to be market-based would have to reflect how much other capital that the GSEs hold. So it's a commitment fee that presumably would change dramatically in that regard over time. The other is commitment fee. People are thinking about it being paid for in a specific fee to the Treasury. It could also, along the lines that I had previously on affordable housing, could be paid for with increased affordable housing expenditures and obligations. That's likewise a return to the Treasury. But there should be some economic realization of it.
We've done a fair amount of math on this issue. In the financial markets, when you don't have an answer or there's not a good comparable, you then triangulate into what the answer would be by looking at things that are similar. And so in that respect, the CRT market that exists today is a great indicator of what the market perceives is the risk embedded within the portfolios. And to be frank, 10 years into the conservatorship now, a substantial amount of the portfolio is turned over. It's a totally different beast that we have today. So looking at the using some Wall Street kind of math, and I won't bore you with it, you can imply from the capital structure of the CRT what a senior commitment should be after first loss positions. You can also take a look at the COCO's market that it used to exist in Europe. You can look at various credit-linked notes. You can look at basic corporate obligations. So there's a number of different tools that you can use to basically triangulate in on what the answer should be. But the CRT market in particular, since it's actually a market signal based on what that is a great opportunity for that.
What's the answer?
Well, the answer changes based on the numbers at any time in the market at any one point in time, but it can range from anywhere, and it's a range. I hesitate to give a specific number, but I'm going to. On a range basis, it could, if you're dealing, one question is, were you dealing with a partial guarantee, or you're dealing with a complete guarantee? And so the risk is the same, but the number can be substantially different. So if you're dealing with a partial guarantee, that could be anywhere from a range of 100 to 150 basis points on the obligation. If you're dealing with a securities-based guarantee.
No, assume current law. We're assuming current law.
Assuming current law, then as I indicated, something in the 50 to 100 basis point range would make sense.
We have time for one more question before we get to our lightning round. Yes.
Hi, John Burlaw, Competitive Enterprise Institute. Thanks for putting this on and everyone for speaking. Mark to market was, and the effect of that on the GSEs was mentioned in as far as the 2008 crisis and being one of the factors at play where, and I know it had a larger effect as far as that where one security would be marked down and in an illiquid market and others would have to, and it created a sort of a panic effect. My question is, I don't know fully the answer. Has anything been done? I remember FASB, the accounting board, relaxed the standard after there was sort of bipartisan congressional outcry, but has anything been done at either legislatively or administratively to rein in a possible systemic effect of mark-to-market and sort of creating the next crisis or helping fuel a crisis?
Anyone want to take that on? Tom? Bud?
No idea.
I would like
All
to
I know is that the FASB is a country unto itself.
And they have come up with Cecil.
Yes.
Yeah.
Len?
I would like to say one thing, though. My friend Mike just gave me a little health warning off to the side here. When you said specifically on existing law, I thought of that as being predominantly on essentially what's the PSPA balance today. So when I said 50 to 100 basis points, I meant to be applied to under existing law. By what that means to me is the existing outstanding PSPA balance. I was not implying 50 to 100 basis points on the entirety or on mortgage rates. That's a very important qualification to make.
Great. Well, we are going to close with a lightning round. This is the second panel on this topic that we've done. And I believe we're probably going to do another one in 18 months, because that appears to be the cycle. And so I'm going to preserve for posterity, or at least the next 18 months when we gather together, where you think we will be on GSE reform in 18 months. Okay? And we will start, Ron, with you.
You're up.
Just a couple bullet points of where you think we'll be.
I think we'll be partway through a capital raise in the GSEs. I think the net worth sweep will have been ended. We will have probably gotten to a point where there is a commitment fee at some point being paid for the support. But I'm thinking we are partway through a capital raise with a plan that at some end date, at some capital level, then the next steps of exiting conservatorship will occur. I do not think there'll be any meaningful, I don't think there'll be any legislation. There'll be lots of probably drafts introduced, maybe hearings, but I think we're still where we're at. But raising capital.
Michaela?
Well, I'm pretty in line with that point. Again, I don't see a lot of legislation done, probably a lot of, debate, hopefully constructive debate.
Yep.
But what I would hope to see is furthering of the mission to serve all the market, and an enhancement of the measures that support affordable housing. For instance, some of the earnings that the GSEs make oftentimes go to other programs that are not strictly housing programs. I would like to see them, housing programs financed more through the GSEs earnings.
Professor?
Well, as a litigator, I learned long ago never to make predictions, but I'll tell you what I'd like to see. I'd like to see in 18 months the completion of stage one of an administrative solution. Now, what is stage one?
Yes.
I
Define that.
Yeah, I think stage one is some of the things we've talked about, and that is a revised structure, an agreement among the parties about how to remove conservatorship, and a way forward that will allow for investment in the future and for the government to make good on its warrants. And I think step one is the guts of that. Then you've got to announce it, you've got to articulate it, people have to believe in it, and then you close on the deal.
Mike?
I think that the administration will attempt to execute administrative reform, that they want a plan that works, and some will be a little more ambitious than the others here. I think they recognize three elements key for a plan that works. One is for stability, it has to have increased affordable housing efforts. An unhappy Chairwoman Waters is not going to be reassuring to Wall Street investors who you're asking to put money into this venture. Second, it will have to have, as Ron said, more robust regulatory authority. We'll need that ring fence or New Jersey walls because an unhappy Chairman Crapo is not particularly reassuring to investors either. And then finally, this is where I think maybe a little more ambitious, but in the same vein, I think it will involve the not just path, but the end of conservatorship, in that I think that will be an essential step before you get new investors. They, I think, will be very squeamish about investing tens of billions of dollars into an entity where the FIFA director has all of the authority of all of the shareholders and all the officers and the board of directors. Do any of you want to sign up for that investment on the way out today? I'll be happy to take you down. So, I think, again, and I think this is Professor indicated, we have, and Ron too, we have a cast of folks who understand financial markets and what it takes to execute a workable, successful plan. And if they move forward, I think they will include the elements essential for it to be a workable plan, and I think those are among the most key essential elements of a plan.
Landon?
I think we'll be, within 18 months, we'll be well into administrative reform. And by administrative reform, I mean that the government is moving forward under the power that's been vested to it under HERA, and both the Treasury and the FHFA. But that does not mean that the administration is thumbing their nose at Congress. Congress does have the ability for oversight. There's no reason that there can't be conversations that continuously take place, particularly with Chairwoman Waters on what her needs of a future state would be. But I do not believe that that will in any way manifest itself into any sort of legislative outcome. So I believe that you can have Congress involved through their oversight function, through rigorous discussion between the parties that are involved here, but you do not need legislative response to get through it. I think that you will see this year, and here this is probably a dangerous comment, but I either in March or the end of June or in September of this year, and I vote March, you'll see the dividend shut off. Because as recently as the Milken Institute article came out, the Milken Institute article, which does not completely align with many of the thoughts that we've had, does align around the thought that the dividend should be suspended and the companies should start to rebuild capital while many of these other issues are being considered and thought out. And what I take particular interest in that is if you look at the 4 signatures on the Milken report, one of them is Dr. Stegman, who was actually one of the participants in the White House at the time when the net worth sweep was put into place. I would hope within this time frame and within this year you'll see recognition that the Fannie and Freddie have paid back in excess of the amount that was drawn from the Treasury, along with in excess of the coupon payments that were required under the original agreement prior to the Third Amendment being put into place. And I would hope that we would see, if the first issuance of reprivatized stock had not been issued, that it would be well underway and there would be a roadshow going on.
Jerron, you close us up.
Okay, well, much of what you've heard already, I do think that you're going to see a recapitalization plan, a capital restoration plan, and it will involve both retaining earnings and something else. I mean, I think there's going to, there will be some resolve for the shareholders. And there will be some private market element to the capital restoration plan. I think it could come with some conditions that concern us on the affordable housing side. And I could see that triggering a bill making it through the House.
Okay.
So.
Well, we'll be revisiting this in 18 months, I think. And so we'll have this preserved for that time. Please join me in thanking our panel.
We'll see.
I want to thank you all for joining us here again. This was one of our California to Capitol Hill conversations. It's part of our ongoing series to address and explore issues that have both federal and California statewide implications. As I mentioned, the next time that we're going to be taking on this set of issues, at least around housing policy, is actually going to be back on our Malibu campus on March 26th. Our conference, A Home in California, will be inviting an interesting group of academics, policymakers, and activists to look at California housing policy. I'm sure the weather is going to be far better than it is here today in Washington, D.C. But thank you again for joining us. We look forward to our next panel together. Thank you.